today we're going to be learning about different types of seams, and the seams that we're going to be going through are the straight seam, the welt seam, the flat felted seam, the French seam, how to do a corner seam and a curved seam. So we're going to be doing several different types, and if you are receiving the last of the packs, you will get some scraps of fabric, a little bit like this. You will also get a template which you'll need to cut out for the curved seam and the corner seam, sorry. And you'll get a selection of scraps that you will need to cut up, and make sure your edges are straight, because if you want a good seam, you'll need a nice straight edge. You'll also get some written instructions for you to follow, and of course you can follow this video and which you'll get to learn how to make the seams. So to begin with, I've got all my fabric ready, and I've done some seams as examples. So that's the French seam. That's the flat felt seam, sorry. It's a basic seam with an edge stitch on. And then this one is a basic stitch with an edge stitch and a top stitch on. And then we've got our curved seam and our corner. Now, to begin with, you will need to cut out your template. Right, so one of the bits that you'll need to do as well is that you'll have scraps of fabric, and on that use the templates to cut out the two pieces for the corner seams. So I've laid mine on my fabric and I've marked it out with a fabric marker, and then I'll cut it out, and same with the curved seam. And I've also marked where I'm going to be sewing. So on the curved seam you'll need 1/4 inch seam allowance, and on the corner seam you can use up to, I would say, about 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch, but I've left an allowance on the template of 1/2 inch. So I'm going to cut this out and get back to you. Seam, and what I've done is I've cut out some fabric and with a nice straight edge, and I've pinned it in place. You need to decide what your seam allowance is. Generally most people either go for 3/8 of an inch, which is just there on that one mark, or 1/2 inch. I'm going to use 1/2 inch just to make things simple, but some people like a centimetre, a smaller seam, but you go for what you feel you need or you've allowed for on your pattern. So I'm going for 1/2 inch seam, and when you start sewing, if you remember, we had the discussion about looking after a sewing machine. Make sure you get to know your sewing machine, how it works, how it stitches, how the stitches the tension needs adjusting. So I'm using a 1/2 inch seam width, and you can either use a ruler and check where your 1/2 inch lands, or on most machines, if you watch my scissors, there's usually a ruler guide. So there's like a 1/4 inch seam, a 1/2 inch seam, 3/4, 1 inch, and you can use that. Some people even have more lines on there to give you a guide on their machine. So depending on what machine you have, you should have some sort of ruler. Some of the tips that people use for sewing a straight seam are they use a seam guide, which it looks like this. It's a magnetic seam guide, and you just place it on your metal plate, and it allows you to guide your sewing. The other thing you can get is you can mark it. So you can mark it with a line, but that would take you a very long time. Or some people I've seen have used a bit of masking tape just on their machine to mark their seam allowance, and that works well as well. So go with what you feel comfortable. I've pinned mine, and I've kept my pin heads on the inside so I can pull them out safely as I go along. So I've set my seam allowance on a 1/2. I've put my foot down, lift my foot up and place my fabric just underneath, just a couple of stitches in, and I'm going to start sewing. back stitch to the end, a couple of stitches, and carry on, and take your pins out as you go along. And I'm using a red thread just so you can see the seams. Normally you'd use a matching coloured thread, finish with a back stitch. And there you have a plain seam. Now there would be different ways of finishing off a plain seam depending on what you were sewing. So you could finish this off with an overlock stitch, an overlocker, and overlock those seams either individually or together. You could zigzag it. To create your second seam, you need to do a straight seam, and then we will need to do a edge stitch and then a top stitch. The edge stitch is at 1/16 of an inch and the top stitch is at 1/4. The top stitch, you can, I know some people like to stick to those measurements, but depending on what you're top stitching on, and it's used for decorative mainly, you can use it and change the measurements. Say for instance you were doing a jean pocket or I don't know, a decorative stitch on something else, you might want to change your measurements, but I'm going to do it for the purpose of this tutorial. I'm going to do a top stitch at 1/4 of an inch and an edge stitch at 1/16 of an inch. Now once you've done those two seams, that will create the welt seam. So this is how it's done. So you need to press your seam flat like I've done on the back there, and then if you position your fabric with the right side facing up, and your seam should be almost literally just touching the inside of the foot there, and that should be 1/16. I don't know if you can see that 1/16 of an inch. You can measure it or use that as a guide. I'm using the edge of my foot as a guide. And with the red thread, you will be able to see if I've actually gone wrong. Finish off nicely with the back stitch, and you've got your beautiful line of edge stitch in there. I'm going to show you the top stitch, and for the top stitch we're doing 1/4, so 1/4 of an inch, so that's 1/2 an inch from the seam. It's 1/4 of an inch, so we're doing 1/4 of an inch, and we're going to start at the top again. So the first one is an edge stitch, that one is a top stitch, and in doing those two stitches on our plain seam, we have created a welted seam. Now on the back you should have 3 lines of stitching like this, and on the front only 2 lines. This creates a really strong seam, so it's great for a good sturdy pair of trousers, a skirt, maybe a tight skirt, a pencil skirt or something like that on the edge, on the side seams of that. And it's actually a really tidy way of sewing too. As you can see, that's not really going to come apart at all. Next we're going to do the flat felled seam, and there are different ways of doing this, and I'm going to show you the way I do them. If you mark, you can either mark or you can go and use the guides on your machine again. So you need on the bottom layer of fabric, so once again your right sides are facing. On the bottom layer of fabric you need 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to mark so you can see, and then on the top layer should be, so total should be half, so it's still 1/4, so 1/4 inch there and 1/2 on the bottom. But if you put your fabric like that, I hope it makes sense, you can see it. So the edge of your fabric should be on the 1/2 inch, but the edge of the top fabric, so the edge of the bottom fabric on the 1/2 inch and the edge of the top fabric is sort of just over your foot, the edge of your foot. It's on the 1/4 line. So to start the flat felled seam, we're going to sew a straight seam all the way down, using your 1/2 inch marker as a guide. So if you use your 1/2 inch marker as a guide, and your seam should look like this. So the top bit will be shorter than the bottom bit. So you've created your seam there. What you need to do is the 1/4 inch that's hanging over, you need to fold that over towards the seam and press it down using an iron. Just press that all the way down and then turn it over like so. Now at this point you can either pin it or just press it down. Pressing it down will be fine. So I've gone over to the iron and I've pressed over the 1/4 inch seam over the other one, and then I folded it over again to enclose that first seam. So now what we've got is we've enveloped the seam completely, so you can't see any raw edges. Now this is great for a fabric that frays like this. It's constantly just coming apart. So it's a really good seam to enclose all your seams. Right, so I'm going to take that first pin off and just place my needle to the fabric. And same stick, same thing I'm going to use. So the next bit we're going to do is we're going to sew that seam down. Again, I'm using the inside of my foot as a guide, and you might want to measure yours, but mine is a 1/16. Just keep tucking your seam under. This is where the ironing helps. When you press it, you get a nice flat seam. And you can see this is your wrong side of your fabric. This is your right side of your fabric. Got a lovely flat seam. Trim off any bits of thread. Created a beautiful seam there. No raw edges. I'm going to use a very, very flimsy, almost Georgette, very thin Georgette type of material, which is the French seam is ideal for, especially if you're sewing something like a see-through blouse, or you've got a skirt with only half the lining and you don't want your seams to show or your raw edges to show. This is a great seam for things like that. It's great for silks, tidying up women's blouses. It's just, I really like the finish on these. So I've got a very, very thin fabric. The first part of the seam is to create a 1/4 inch seam. So what I'm going to do is, and try and use really fine pins. I haven't got any here at the moment, but try and use really fine pins because you don't want to make little snags or holes in them, holes in the fabric. So just pin them in place there. So I've got them together. So when you're calculating your seam allowance, you need to leave a 1/2 inch seam, but when we sew the first seam, you're only sewing a 1/4 inch. You have to remember that you don't start with 1/2 inch, you're starting with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to place my fabric underneath my foot at a 1/4 inch, and I've got my wrong sides facing each other. So this is probably the only time that you'd have the wrong sides on a seam, that you'd have the wrong sides facing each other to start with. Once again, I'm using red on all these fabrics so you can see them on the camera. So I've done my first 1/4 inch seam. Now at this point, if you want to, you can trim this down just a little bit in half. Press it both sides, so fold that seam over that side and then press it, and do the same again. So your edge, so your seam there should be on the edge when you've pressed it. So I've pressed my seam flat and folded it over on both sides, and what you should have is your actual the inside of your seam on the inside. So now you've got your wrong side on the top and you've got your right sides facing, and we're going to do another seam of a 1/4 inch. Now you can see this seam because it is in red, but if you did this in the matching thread, what I meant to say was if you did it in a matching thread, you wouldn't actually see the seam like that. But there you go. That's your French seam. That's your right side of the fabric, and that's your wrong side of the fabric. And the actual seam is enclosed in that French seam. No raw edges showing on the outside. If you still manage to have got a few threads, just trim them off carefully. But there should be no raw edges showing on either side. And I absolutely love this one for sheer blouses. So if you remember, I've cut out, using the template that's also included in your pack if you're receiving a pack. If not, you can cut your own out. What you'll need to remember is that you'll need excess around to make a nice corner. So depending on what you are, I often leave extra so that we can adjust it once it's sewn in. So this seam is really useful, or the corners to practice are really useful for things like chair covers, for collars, for corners on the end of a dress or something like that. So if you're doing like a kaftan style dress, but generally any corner sewing, this is a great one to practice for. So to begin with, I did mark, I don't know if you remember, just my corners there and there, and I'm going to join that seam first. So I'm going to join one side first, and my blue dots should meet there, and that's where I'm going to stop and turn my fabric. So I won't be talking during the actual sewing. I'm still using a 1/2 inch seam on this one. And at this point, leave your needle in. Now I've marked mine incorrectly for some reason, so I'm going to ignore that mark. Leave your needle, it needs to be about 1/2 inch in from that corner. Leave your needle in, lift your foot up. Now at this point you turn your fabric, so you turn your bottom fabric away from you and your top fabric towards you. And just straighten it out. Pull your corner out nicely. Flatten. It is a bit fiddly, but if you take your time, it can be done. Make sure there's no bits. I'm just going to lift mine again and just straighten that out because I can see a couple of puckers there. Oops, and I've accidentally cut mine. So I've accidentally cut my thread there, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to snip that corner, and actually I should have done that to start with. So snip that into the corner there. I'm going to go back and start there. Same again, keep your needle in the fabric. Turn, push that one away and push this one towards you. Line your edges of your seam up. And you should have a little snip on the bottom one, but nothing on the top. And there you go, you've got a nice corner seam. Now please try and use matching thread. Mine I haven't, just to show you, but that's how it will work out, and you can then press your seam nice and flat. I'm going to go over to the iron and press that and then come back and show you. When you're doing a curved seam, one of the things that you need to remember is that you're going to be sewing on the stretch, so you can see that that really stretches, and that does too. So when you're sewing, don't pull or push too much, and just take it easy around the curved area. This can be used for lots of things as well, and often on shirt edges sometimes you've got a curved seam on that, so you need to practice your curved seams, and try hemming them, try doing a seam on a curved seam. You have plenty of material in your packs to have a go. Just cut up small curved seams and keep trying them, so you get into the habit of doing them. For a curved seam, curves work better with 1/4 inch. Most seams I do is 1/2 inch or 3/8, but on a curved seam I tend to do 1/4 just because there's not as much bulk on there. So here we go. remember, do a few stitches at a time, take your time and don't pull or push too much. Just try and give yourself that time to go around that curve. See on there, material's just slightly about to pucker, so before it even does that, I'm just going to straighten it out with a pin and hold it in place there so I can finish nicely. Now you've got your curved seam, it won't lie flat, well that's pretty good actually, but it may not lie completely flat, so what you can do in order for it to lie flat is just cut on the curved area, just cut a couple of, these scissors aren't great, notches in. Don't cut your seam off, and that will help you get a nice curved finish. Your curve lies flat, you can cut notches into that curved area, make sure you don't cut the stitching. And then it will lie a lot flatter and give it a good press.